Well, as in the Christian world we begin Lent, it's a good time to reflect on doing good and why we do it and who does it. As the readings for yesterday, for Ash Wednesday, show from the Gospel, Jesus' main concern in talking about good works is, why are you doing it? They already have their reward, if they're doing it to be seen. So it's about pure love, altruism, or when does the ego get in there, even in doing good? I remember as a young Jesuit, I was reading a treatise. It was from the beginning of the 20th century. I think it was a young French priest named Roussillon, as I recall. I think he died during the First World War. That he was writing these things on the concept of pure love in the Middle Ages. And even at the time, in my highly ascetical period, I was saying, it was all wrapped up in the mind, how can there be pure love? How can you do absolutely selfless? How can you do something with no reference to yourself? And of course, you can't. It's absurd. Because there's this network of relation, and it's all coming from you or passing through, related to you. I mean, there's no such thing as, selfless in that sense, especially as it was understood. And of course, Zen helps us with this very much. But even Jesus said, quoting the Torah, love your neighbor as yourself. And so this initial reference to yourself that allows you to love others. But again, who or what is this self? And who's doing the loving and what's being loved? Even in the readings today, it says, if you love your life, you'll lose it, and if you lose your life, you know it. So it's very tricky. And there's a famous, I always remember the Latin phrase, qui sibi nequam cui bonus, which means, if you're rotten towards yourself, to whom are you going to be good? So that's like love your neighbor as yourself. Anyway, my real inspiration for dealing with the question is David Brooks. Back to the New York Times. Last week, the op-ed, David Brooks, as many of you know, often deals with philosophical and moral and spiritual questions. So this is talking about moral radicalism. And particularly, how altruistic must one be is the question. So this is an interesting presentation of some of the questions. The fact that we're all one to begin with. We're all the body of Christ, we're all the Buddha, we're all one. So as I say, who's loving and who's being loved and who's, as St. Augustine says, there's this one Christ loving himself. So the self is the capital S. The self is loving the self with a capital S. So, for example, he quotes something happened in the German prisoner of war camp in the Second World War. A Nazi held a gun to the sergeant's head and said, "Where are all the Jews?" And everyone stepped forward and said, "We're all Jewish." Of course, they all were. We're all Jews, and we're all Buddhists, and we're all Christians, and we're all human, and we're all plants, and we're all trees, and we're all divine. There's just one. So that's the first thing we have to realize, that there's only one to begin with. There's no other, as Bernie Glassman says. There is no other. How can you love your neighbor as yourself? There is no other. It's just the one. So he's speaking out against the people who are driven by moral rage and need to be a pure service to the world. They despise comfort and require a life that is difficult, ascetic, and self-sacrificial. Now it sounds heroic, but there's something wrong with that. Is that the right attitude to have when it's really the self with a capital S who's acting? Or is there more of a narrow, egotistical, frantic quality to that? He's asking that, really. These extreme do-gooders, as he says. Well, yeah, in a sense. For them, it's always wartime. You can understand the moral passion, and he does say that, but I mean, is that really the attitude that's most fruitful and it's the most authentic? The do-gooders feel themselves conscripted to duty. You have to act out of duty. It sounds like Immanuel Kant, or are you doing it out of happiness, love? And what does that feel like? So, once again he affirms, he quotes someone who says, there's only one. The evil in this world is the creation of those who make a distinction between the self and other. Well, that's true. So if you're away from this notion that we're all one, well then there's going to be egotism, there's going to be separation, there's going to be competition, and suspicion, and fear, anger, and all these things are going to get in there. So that is just a fair statement that the evil of the world comes from that. But what is the opposite? The argument against this pure moral heroism, and I hate that word even though we speak about heroic sanctity, because it's too egotistical sounding, really. Willpower. Fanaticism in the relief of suffering is still a form of fanaticism. Really? Interesting. It makes reciprocal relationships difficult because one is always giving and never receiving. See, and that's an egotistical temptation. Always be giving and never receiving, because you're never vulnerable and you're never accountable. It's always just... So it's tempting to say love is giving, period. But it's not true. Or else, who's the giving and who's giving to whom? And you're part of that. So it is receiving at the same time. Because it's just the self giving the self. So, and you can tell when you use language like this, a world in which everyone strove to achieve moral sainthood. All right, there's a lot that's wrong with that, because as we know from our sitting, if it's too much effort striving to achieve something, which is already are, then it's the ego getting in the way. A world in which everyone strove to do this would probably contain less happiness than a world in which people realize the diversity of ideals involving a variety of personal values. So in other words, Baryshnikov or Djokovic with dancing or tennis does more for the world than if they were trying to cure cancer in Africa. Because that's what they're called to do. That's their thing. And they bring more joy and energy to the world by doing that. So it's a matter of finding who you really are in the flow of things. And finally, he does end by saying, I don't want to let us off the hook here. Most of us are far too on the comfortable end and too far from the altruistic one. We're just so caught up in our egos. So we need to make a leap, a daring leap. But we have to do it right. So I just look briefly at what a couple of authors say about this question along these lines. Now, in The Power of Now, Eckhart Tolle, speaking on the contrary of this kind of moral effort to be totally pure and heroic and all this stuff, he says, if there is no joy, ease, or lightness in what you are doing, then you're too caught up in time and life is perceived as a burden and a struggle. You just have to change how you're doing it. As soon as you honor the present moment, as soon as you're fully present, in other words, as soon as you wake up to the full reality of what is and who you are, all unhappiness and struggle dissolve. Now that's quite a statement. If you really wake up to the full dimensions of things, who the self is, etc., what the self does, all unhappiness and struggle dissolve, and life begins to flow with joy and ease. Even in difficult circumstances, even in suffering, even in working for others, well, yes. When you act out of present moment awareness, whatever you do becomes imbued with a sense of quality, care, and love. So the unhappiness and the struggle and all of that comes from the ego. That's saying quite a bit. You may not even agree with it. For example, yourself doesn't depend on the outcome, whether you're successful or not. It's the actual doing which is important. Everything is honored, but nothing matters. Nothing real can be threatened. So all the masters testify to this. That there's an ease and a lightness and a joy in when you're really attuned. And all of that heroic struggle, is absent because it's coming from a higher source. Your life is coming from a higher source, and you are that life. And you finally realize it. The Conversations with God, which I recommend, by the way, says, the biggest mistake people make in human relationships is to be concerned with what the other is wanting, being, doing, or having. Be concerned only for the self, with a capital S. So it's not you acting, and it's not you responding to whatever the other thinks, needs, or wants. It's responding to something deeper. What is the self wanting, needing, choosing? Self with a capital S. The highest choice for the self, capital S, becomes the highest choice for another when the self, capital S, realizes there is no one else. So it's just an easy, spontaneous love of another because there is no other. And when you give to another, you're giving to yourself because there's only the self. And you experience that. When you disappear, it's the self. It stems from knowing who you really are. Comes up a number of times in the... One of your cultural myths about love is that it's about giving rather than receiving. This is God speaking, by the way. This has become a cultural imperative, and it is driving you crazy, causing more damage than you could ever imagine. Just unite into the flow. There's no distinction between giving and receiving. Keeps people in bad marriages, etc. Nobody dares to point out this truth, this myth. And he concludes by saying, you cannot truly give to another for the simple reason that there is no other. If we're all one, then there's only you. But the real you, capital U, capital Y. And to get right down to earth, book I've quoted before, Selfless Love by Roshi Ellen Burks, Beyond the Boundaries of Self and Other, which is her last book, which is really wonderful. As I think I mentioned to you before, she and her husband Charles are both Roshis. They were Roshi Kennedy's first successors, and she's a nurse, so she's engaged in helping others as a profession. But she still has selfless love, and it means selfless in both senses. Selfless love, altruism, but also there's no self. So of course love is selfless. There's no self. And there's only one self, if there's any self. The Buddha self, the Christ self. The love which is our true life. So she has a chapter on what selfless love isn't. Selfless love is not a life of self-sacrificing martyrdom. Self-sacrifice that Brooks spoke of. If you feel like you're sacrificing yourself, you're not doing it right. There's no self to sacrifice. And it's a flow of love. It's joyous and light. Selflessness is not the same as self-sacrifice, because it is based on the direct experience that there's no separate self to begin with. So you're still caught in the illusion of your ego if there's all this self-sacrifice going on. You haven't caught into the flow yet. Self and others are not separate. Many people fear that if they love selflessly, they will be at risk for burnout or compassion fatigue. But true selfless love does not tire you out. That's important to realize. True selfless love does not tire you out. Why? Because you're just caught in the flow of a love and a self much bigger than your ego. And you're just channeling it. It's limitless. It's a joyous flow. You can't burn out if you're doing it right. The exhausted, dried up feeling of burnout is a clear message that you are not experiencing selflessness. And you are not loving from the experience that you are, rather than that you have God's love. The love of the small, limited self is itself small and limited. So you run out of energy when you're living from that. Self-love realizes that there is no separate self that needs to love endlessly in order to demonstrate its worth, proving that you're holy, proving that you're worthy of heaven, and all that stuff. That's all ego. You are God's love, now and forever. When the separate self tries to earn love by constantly working to fix all the world's problems, at home and abroad, it becomes unbalanced and ends in exhaustion, depleted of its limited resources. When the whole self loves, it is constantly changing, revitalizing, reconnecting, and realizing that it is unbounded love and possibility. Selfless love is not ignoring your own needs in order to meet the needs of others. Selfless love reveals your needs and allows you to respond to them with care and concern. In addition to time for daily spiritual practice, you need exercise, sleep, nutritious food, water, affection, and play. So go on vacation without scruple. Selfless love acknowledges these human needs in yourself and others. So it's balanced by caring for yourself and developing your talents. Also, when you stop doing everything for others, they learn how to do it for themselves. You don't create dependence. That book also says it in Caring for the Conversations with God. If you truly love another, you don't create them you don't make them dependent on you. You set them free. Even if it means helping them, but it's helping them to grow and to become free. So if you're making people become dependent on you, then it's an ego trip. It has nothing to do with self-loving the self and liberating the self and freeing the self. So she goes on, about, and of course, selfless love is not angry or self-righteous. That goes without saying. If you are not in touch with the love that is who you really are, you are not able to radiate the peace, love, and joy you hope to create in the world. So selfless love, no martyrdom, no exhaustion, no self-righteousness, and no merit. So much for pure love. I think what you really see, in Buddhist terms, that it is about losing yourself and finding yourself, the big self, the Christ self, the Buddha self, and living in that current, that dance, which is loving and joyous and light and unlimited in energy. And you are the beneficiary as well as the channel of that. Any comments?